really good. I congratulate you on it.
Thank you.
I've been spending a lot of time at the UN, and they tell me it's really a big bestseller there. That people are really, they can't keep it in stock.
It's amazing. They're selling hundreds of them at the bookstore there.
That's good.
I can't think of any place I'd rather see it.
Right. It's an important place for it to be.
Yeah.
And your background is really interesting. Welcome very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Dr. David Korten. And Dr. Korten is what we want to talk about primarily is the author of an extremely interesting book that's been out a year or so now in the United States and on the world scale. And I want to show it right at the outset to let people know what it looks like. But it's called When Corporations Rule the World. And this happens to be the paperback edition, but it's been out, I guess, now a year or so. And is doing, we were just chatting off, that is doing very, very well at the United Nations, where well it ought, and it ought to do well with the whole world community in terms of trying to understand what's taking place. And David Korten, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you. Pleasure to be
here. We want to talk about the book and some of the implications you bring up, but I find in these things it's very best, usually best if we let you share, if you would, with the audience your own background, some of your academic background, your personal background, and then we can start talking about the implications of a world where the corporations run it all, as you see it. But would you share your own background for us, please?
Well, you know, it's been quite a journey, and I sometimes feel that that the whole thing has almost been preparation for what I'm doing now in terms of this message.
You do,
but, you know, as you know, my academic background is from Stanford University, and I have an M.B.A. and Ph.D. from the Stanford Business School.
Right, in business?
In business,
okay, right.
Actually, I mean, one thing that's significant, it's actually in the area of organization and organization systems. So when I look at economics issues, it's not from the perspective of an economist, but rather the perspective of organizational systems or behavioral systems and the nature of the incentives and the dynamics and how they actually work.
Okay, interesting, yeah.
So that's the perspective from which I look at things like the global economy.
Yeah, okay.
Now, actually with that background, I took a rather unusual career course because I became fascinated, actually my last year of undergraduate work, with the problems of poverty in third world countries, as we called them then, underdeveloped countries. And set about, first of all, to set up business schools in the third world. My wife and I set up the business school in Haile Selassie University in Ethiopia, and then I was the Harvard Business School advisor to the Central American Management Institute, all on the theory that bringing modern management skills to people of third world countries was the way to develop their economies and bring them into the modern age.
Okay, and that is important, that their management and the ability.
Management is very important.
You were in the business school. You're not someone who was just in a broad brush kind of way condemning business or something of that sort.
Not at all.
You know these management skills are essential, and business itself, and the private sector, and all of these things are essential to the progress of the world society.
You know, it's important. You know, I've been on talk shows where somebody call and say, "Oh, this sounds like a '60s or '60s lefty," and of course, in the '60s, I was setting up business schools, and I was doing my military service during the Vietnam War. So
conservative, right? You have conservative credentials, right?
Very much so, and I do push that now that that my message tends to move well beyond the conservative message.
Do you think you have changed in your view of the world?
Oh, absolutely.
You've had a change.
Oh, absolutely.
In terms of the way you saw things, and you saw the world differently when you were building these business schools and so forth than you have come to see it.
Very much so.
Yeah, an epiphany of some sort, or how
well, there was no sudden event. It's been a very long, gradual process of, you know, I began to. You know, first of all, was concentrating on training managers for business organizations, and even you know, there's a time when I was in business school that I got fascinated with the role of multinational corporations, we called them at that time, and you know, their potential to bring development to poor countries. So that was one of the things I was particularly interested in. But then, you know, I gradually started getting interested in problems of public sector management, and eventually into development programs, particularly programs that were trying to deal with the issues of rural areas, like, you know, irrigation development programs and small-scale agricultural development.
Did you get
health
involved in
programs and things like
community
that.
development activities, or what did you think of those? Or
Well, a number of the things I was involved with dealt with community development, and I think the spirit of that is very is very much in the right line. But part of what I came to realize, particularly working, with time I ended up moving away from the international aid establishment. I worked for many years for USAID.
for how long?
Well, for 8 years with USAID.
Oh, I see.
I also worked in the field 3 years with the Ford Foundation. And eventually came to realize that the foreign aid programs generally could not deal with the real issues. I mean, many of the projects that we worked with were attempting to deal with poverty, but they couldn't deal with the structural issues. And in fact, one of the things that we found was that almost invariably, the programs funded by development agencies, like in irrigation, which was an area we specialized in a lot, that if you looked at what was happening traditionally, in many areas of Asia where we worked, for hundreds of years, farmers had gotten together and developed their own irrigation systems with their own resources, ran them themselves, and so forth. Now, what happens when you come in with a government-funded irrigation scheme?
Some big shot from Iowa.
Well, you get the advisors from Iowa, but you also get the bureaucrats from the national agency coming down.
Right. Okay.
And we would experience projects funded by major donors, by the Japanese or by the Asia Development Bank or the World Bank, that would go into an area where the farmers had for centuries been running amazing irrigation systems, highly complex and very efficient, and they'd essentially obliterate those. They'd wipe them out.
And those farmers were very carefully in touch with the ecology about them, because they were often on the edge, and they didn't have a lot of wiggle room to be doing things that were sort
they knew
of
how to work
cavalier experiment. Right?
They knew how to work in balance with nature.
And they had to also, because very often they're very close to it. Those harvest year to year.
Absolutely.
They really depend on it, and so this cavalier sort of theoretical kind of let's try something new is not something that is necessarily going to sit so well with them, nor should it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the worst tragedies we observed was on the island of Bali in Indonesia. It's an amazing culture. The whole culture is built around the irrigation organizations. That's the foundation of the community. And the systems are just elegant. They're just they're astounding. And some of them, one that we were particularly amazed by, the farmers literally tunneled through 30 kilometers of mountain to get the water to their fields.
30 miles?
Yeah, 30 kilometers.
Oh, 30 kilometers. Well, that's still a real.
But then you get a big development bank coming in the name of helping the poor, giving a big foreign exchange loan to the country, and the engineers come in and wipe this out. And you can imagine the farmers are not always terribly pleased with this help.
Right. Well, you must have been aware that coming out of your graduate school and everything, you were interested in developmental possibilities for helping the people in the less developed world. So you were in the aid.
We're in the aid business,
bureaucracy, and so you were
exactly.
So your conscience must have been there, thinking and doing it. Were you doing it in the sense of trying to really help, and were you committed to it, or were you doing it just as a sort of way to see the world and get a good gig and good job, or what was your consciousness?
We were deeply committed to it,
right,
and
you and your wife worked together.
Yes, and she worked. She still continued to work for the Ford Foundation and still does. And the results, particularly of her work, were quite extraordinary because. We developed programs that she was managing with Ford Foundation funds that could actually take a situation with an irrigation agency that's engaged in this kind of atrocity and begin to turn the policies around so that it in fact would work in support of the small irrigator groups. And provide them technical support and funding by which to not to obliterate their systems and replace them with a bureaucratically managed and engineered system, but rather to incrementally upgrade their own facilities.
You were thinking of that when you were in the aid agency yourself, or were you building?
Well, that was before. We got into this in the Philippines with the Ford Foundation before I moved over to AID.
Okay.
And what we learned that it's possible to work with the aid bureaucracies to essentially turn them on their head, turn them upside down, so that instead of coming in with blueprinted plans that they impose, they work with the community, find out what the real needs are, and work up. So it's
democracy.
Yeah, and so it's in the spirit of community development.
Yeah,
exactly.
They tried to do that and work with the community and let it come from there rather than be imposed. Right. Yeah.
Now, you see the difference between what we were doing when we were working with the bureaucracy to bring about this change in normal community development is that most community development interventions go village by village.
Yeah, right.
And they're
community by community.
Yeah, they're discrete projects.
Right.
Now, what we were dealing with in the irrigation case is a process of dealing with a whole resource management system, a whole national program for irrigation development to turn the policies around from a policy focused on creating very large, very expensive irrigation systems that often didn't work very well.
Right.
With a program of providing support on a systematic basis to communities so that they increase their own control over that resource.
Yeah.
So you get into the same kind of issues. I mean, it can be in healthcare, or very major one that that my wife worked with and still working with is in forestry. The whole difference between whether you manage huge government-run forest areas and then you contract out to be logged off by big corporations, or whether you organize the forest resource so that that land and the trees is controlled and managed by the community, and that the harvest is selective, is sustainable, and is used in a way that keeps the economic value in the community.
Now, what about those who are going to say that in order to keep all of these local controls and the possibility that you're going to forestall the possibility of realizing large economies of scale? I mean, how can you ever have a combine that can get all of the advantages of technology and get the production up and the productivity up and so forth by catering to all these small interests that don't see the big picture? What do you say to those people?
Okay. What we're dealing with there is one of the major fallacies of development. And it turns out to be a major conflict between the perspective of ordinary people and the perspective of people who work in the big corporations, who work in central governments, who work within what I sometimes call the economy of money. And it's a system that is to some extent creating wealth, but in many respects is much more engaged in the concentration of wealth, the transfer of wealth. Now, just like when you go in with an irrigation bureaucracy and take over the small irrigation systems, you're taking control away from the people, and you're allocating more resources to a bureaucracy rather than to actual meeting needs of the local community.
Yeah, right.
Now, the same
thing. Take
thing.
away their sense of autonomy, too.
Yeah, but I mean, you take, exactly. Oh, very much so, and break down the social structure.
Right, right.
But of course, even worse are the programs of, like the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank that come in and if there are any subsidies for small-scale farmers, they'll pull those out and they'll shift the subsidies to the export-oriented corporations that are producing bananas or pineapples or whatever for sale in the global market. Now, what you do is you then end up driving the small farmers off of the land, which is then taken over by corporate interests if the land's any good. And they'll employ a few people at generally very low wages.
Right.
Other people, okay, that's large scale, economies of scale, higher productivity, and so forth.
Right, or production, perhaps,
Well, it may or may not be more total production, but it's certainly more profitable because you're not consuming none of these people consuming their own produce.
Right. No.
But to the extent that you're if there were really good jobs for these people, which is the theory. I mean, you go into if they go into a factory job with a union scale and earn $20 an hour or something, you'd say, well, okay, they're better off than they were as small-scale farmers, subsistence farmers.
Even if that process is playing havoc with the environment.
Well, that's another issue. But the fact is that most of those people who are pushed off of their farms, it's the same kind of phenomenon that we see in Mexico right now. As NAFTA is increasingly pushing subsidized U.S. grain into Mexico, driving the farmers off. So what they're pushed into the maquiladoras. They're not getting union scale wages. They're getting $1, $1.50 a day, or whatever it is.
Right. Is it that low? Yeah, is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, don't quote me on
No,
the
okay,
specific,
right.
but
I
I mean that's the kind of
point.
scale that
Right.
we're working with,
Yeah.
and my understanding is the wages have in fact been
Yeah.
falling in Mexico with NAFTA. So, you know, people living in absolutely squalid conditions, absolutely no job security. Very often the jobs are so hazardous, or, you know, you get repetitive stress syndrome and so forth that, you know, you hire young kids, young women, and within a few years they're incapacitated. They can hardly work at all.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, what you're really doing is not providing better opportunities for people, but transferring control over the wealth, over the natural resource base that they use for their subsistence, and over, you know, economic activity in general. Of course, that's what's happening
to these gigantic corporations.
To these gigantic
that
corporations.
embody the capital assets.
Yeah.
Increasingly.
Which you know, which in turn are controlled by the global financial markets.
Right. Okay.
Which have transmortified into just absolute
Great
monsters
word.
that are that have only one goal, which is maximizing short-term profits.
Well, yeah, that's always been the case with business. You were in the business school. You weren't, you know, is to increase their or to safeguard their profits. The trustees.
Obviously,
if I may, when you go back to your academic training and you came up, did you have a basis of theoretical understanding of economics? I mean, you studied
of course.
Adam Smith, and you studied Say, and you studied Ricardo, and
well,
all
there's
of these
not.
guys. Or did you have a system that came into the modern period where you could see yourself, in a certain sense, as a Keynesian, as a supply-sider, as a or did you have a system of economics understanding, macroeconomic understanding, against which all of these other kinds of thoughts were in somehow, you know, gestating in your own mind?
Yeah, I mean, we of course.
Or can you label yourself?
Studied economics in
no, but I'm
business
saying
school, but it's
personally
not,
to yourself. Did you have a system of economics that you cottoned to, as it were?
Not really.
Sense?
No,
really.
I was not at that point a student of economic theory. In fact, I actually started out as an economics major as an undergraduate.
Right.
And I found it just deadly boring.
That's what everyone says,
uninteresting.
The dismal science. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
And it's somehow, you know, even though it relates to the most basic things in our everyday life, it somehow didn't seem to relate to any kind of reality.
Yeah.
And at that point, you know, I came from a rather unsophisticated background and I was the first one in my family to go to college.
Oh, well, good.
And so, you know, I remember, I have this vivid recollection of reflecting on my economics courses and saying, you know, I came to Stanford to get an education.
Right.
And, you know, I'm really not enough into it. I'm not even sure I really know what it means to be educated, but I have a very strong sense that studying economics is not it.
You know, it's really funny. We did a program once with Isaac Asimov, and it was amazing. You see the books. He'd written hundreds of books. Yeah. And they had to start from Shakespeare to, you know, arithmetic formula and so and sort of thing. And I asked him, what is the one is there anything he hadn't written on? Because he'd written on everything. And one was economics. Yeah. It was just couldn't face it. It was just too boring. And yet it is. And do you think all those macroeconomic considerations, despite the boringness of it and that sort of thing, it still seems to be, in some sense, that is the rationale behind which so much of these things you're talking about are taking place, and that whether we like it or not, in a certain sense, it's incumbent upon us to try and understand in some sort of way the economic rationale by which we allow these corporations to move that way, and this laissez-faire development and all of these kind of things.
You know. And you know, in a way, my my book is it's about economics.
Sure,
but it's not from the perspective of classical, well, not classical, but neoclassical, the contemporary economics. And you know, one reason economics is so boring, I mean, is that it doesn't relate to reality. I mean, the economics as it's taught. I mean, you know, the further I get into it, the more I come to the conclusion that what's taught as economics in our universities is much more an ideological indoctrination. It has
including Marx and
well, yeah. I mean, we don't teach we don't teach much Marx.
No, but it was taught to much of the world consciousness for a long period of time.
It was, but see, that's a more well, I can't stand to read Marx. It's so turgid. But although many people say my own analysis is
no, it
in many
reads very,
respects
no, it reads like a novel. I'm saying.
Well, no, but I mean, much of it's a Marxist kind of analysis, but it certainly doesn't read like Marx. But,
no, but you're both concerned with the plight of the less advantaged people in our world society.
Yeah.
And that comes through very nicely,
exactly.
very well.
And it's this involvement with institutions and how institutions allocate power that's essential to understanding our world and understanding the global economy.
Yeah.
And that's an area that most contemporary economists don't really deal with. In fact, one of the things that was so striking to me is in writing the book, it actually pushed me to go back and read some of the classical economists, and I went back and spent some time with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations.
Right.
And it's extraordinary. His Wealth of Nations is an extraordinary book.
He was a moral philosopher to start with. Yeah,
he was. But he also, I think he was one of the first real social science systems thinkers. He was trying to understand systems of relationships and institutions and the dynamic of them.
Right.
In a way that it seems to me that most economists can't do now, which is part of the weakness of the field.
Yeah.
Now, the really striking thing that I got into was realizing that the whole foundation of market economics, as it grows out of Marx, is based on a number of assumptions. Most particularly,
as it grows out of Marx or it grows out of
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith. Is that the units of production are small and local.
They were in his time, yeah.
But that's also his ideal.
Yeah.
The whole book, The Wealth of Nations, is almost a tirade against any kind of corporate concentration or combine or monopoly.
Or government.
Now, see, that's trickier. His concern about government was not that it did interfere with the lives of ordinary people, but that it existed mainly to protect the monopoly powers of state corporations or state-related corporations. I mean, that's where most of his criticisms. You go through the index and check back on any of his criticisms of government. And of course, in his time, the whole idea that government would be involved in environmental regulation and any kind of social welfare activity or redistribution was just not part of the consciousness. That was not so.
The days of satanic mills.
Yeah, I find no sense in which he was attacking the functions of government that now the conservatives are trying to get rid of. What he was attacking were the functions of government that are exactly those areas that our current government and politicians are trying to protect, which are the subsidies to the corporations and the implementation of rules that favor the big corporations at the expense of the possibilities of small firms and maintaining control of local economies. So I think if Adam Smith were alive, he'd be
where would he be?
He'd probably be much closer to be a Schumacher.
Schumacher. I mean, I meant Schumacher. I didn't say Schumpeter is another one that's come along. But he probably was small as beautiful.
Yeah, it's a much more of a Schumacher kind of philosophy.
Well, that maybe we're reading into it what we because he's the basis of it and so forth. But you didn't. Do you count yourself then in terms of economics? You're a Schumacher kind of person, or
very much aligned with Schumacher.
Right.
But I'd also say aligned with Adam Smith in many ways. In fact, sometimes I make the case that I'm an advocate of the market economy.
You are an advocate of market economy, okay?
Yeah, and our current problem is specifically that we don't have a market economy.
We don't have free entry to capital asset ownership, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the problem of excessive government control, but the problem is that what we have is a corporate managed economy, centrally planned corporate economy.
Yeah, and you say Paul Hawkins says the only reason you have big government is because you have big corporations. They have to respond to it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, that's an amazing insight.
Yeah.
If you have big corporations and you have big government to restrain their excesses and to clean up their messes. And there's a lot to that, which means if we really don't want big government, which I'm not much of a fan of myself, but okay, along with scaling down government, we've got to scale down the size of our corporations and economic units.
But what about the people who say if you scale, you could only do that by artificially not allowing them to realize all the technological advantages that large economies of scale do offer?
Possibly.
And we should do that in the name of not allow the efficiencies for increased production that those economies of scale offer in the name of some other values or something, or?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we need to realize that economies supposedly exist to serve people, not to serve the generation of corporate profits.
Well,
now, if a corporation can make profits serving people, terrific.
Well, he used to, Mr. Smith used to say that, you know, the invisible hand will distribute, and it's supply and demand, and the visible hand will distribute, and people are best off if they just pursue their own interests, and then the economy of the society will increase most rather than those who are trying to do good.
Now, you know, it's almost never mentioned. The only place in the Wealth of Nations where he mentions the invisible hand, I really should memorize this sentence, but it's embedded in a sentence in which he says that because essentially the intelligent investor will want to invest locally where he can control his own assets, thereby by pursuing his interest, he will maximize the benefit to the larger society, or something to that effect.
And these others have just all blown that out of context.
Yeah, I mean, the critical thing there is the assumption that it's local investment, and that, of course, is critical to trade theory. The whole idea that trade is mutually beneficial, an absolutely essential assumption of that theory is that capital is rooted locally, that it cannot move outside the boundaries of the economy.
It's sure not the case these days.
No, I mean, now what we've got is these massive movements.
$1 trillion a day of speculative capital in the currency market.
Some people say it's up to 104 trillion.
Really?
Yeah, and that's only the money that is unrelated to any real transactions in real goods and services.
104 trillion? What?
104 trillion.
Over what period of time?
Every day.
How can that be? I mean, there isn't that much money in the world, is there?
Well, what it involves, I mean, a lot of it is, is very fast trading back and forth. I mean, it's not investment. It's speculating on currency transactions.
Right, right.
And I think a major chunk of that movement is of course also in what's known as arbitrage. It's the guys with very big amounts of money, very big computers, catching momentary imperfections between the Tokyo market for currency and the New York market. So, it's trading at a fraction of currency's trading a fraction of a cent difference in the two. So they place simultaneous orders to take advantage of the spread. So, that sort of thing in a way is not terribly consequential. Except that it's just a tax on the system. So far as I can see it, provides no useful service.
Doesn't, I mean, it doesn't produce any product or anything, right.
No.
But it's there in the system, and it's there.
The traders say it maintains the liquidity of the system, but I think, at the scale at which it's being done, that's nonsense. It's pure extraction.
Has this something developed, this world where the corporations are so important in this finance, international finance? Is this something that's new, evolving? Has it not been evolving in that way? Have not the corporations always been powerful, major arbiters of what goes on in the national economy and the national society? Or has it changed in some qualitative new way, in your view? And if so, when did the change occur, and what led to it, and what occurred it, and what brought it about?
Yeah, I think it's been a very, very long trend, and I make no pretense of being a historian, but it's an area I'd love to study more because it is really fascinating when you get into it. And
Rockefeller, when he was for the robber barons, it's got a history of this kind of thing. Which,
well, we had this period after the Civil War, where you had the rise of the big corporations, and it was a fairly rapid movement. And of course, one of the things that we neglect from our history is that back from the foundations of the United States, there was very little corporate activity, and it was very, very strictly regulated. A lot's changed very, very recently. I've got a colleague that noted that even as recently as the 1950s in Wisconsin, it was a felony for a corporation to make a political contribution.
Really? Yeah, that's quaint.
Isn't
that a quaint thing?
Yeah. But also a darn good idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they may be getting around to that campaign reform. I don't know, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think it's absolutely one of the things that we've got to, if we want to restore democracy, we have to do that.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, another one of the anomalies, of course, is the current idea that comes purely out of Supreme Court decisions that the corporations have constitutional rights.
As a personality.
Of persons, yeah. And of course, if you read the Constitution, there's no mention of the corporation. The original Constitution, we would have to presume that the Founding Fathers didn't necessarily even expect they were going to exist.
Did you think then that the Supreme Court was wrong in that decision? Or
that's absolutely wrong.
And that it ought to be revisited or something?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Right. I think it's just flat out dead wrong.
That would change a great deal if it were, right?
I mean, if we're talking about human rights, we're talking about rights of human beings, of living persons. Corporations are artificial entities.
But they're given this personal nature in terms of the law and the understanding and the protections of that, right?
And that, basically, so far as I can see, I mean, that reflects the degree of corruption of our legal system.
You think it was a corruption of the Supreme Court that led to that?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. Interesting. You think? Okay.
And you got a lot of the members of the Supreme Court come out of the legal system, which is engaged with serving corporate clients and serving the rich, and there's a frame of reference that comes to that.
Hasn't it always been so, though? The rich were served. The rich have been served in societies ever since the beginning of mankind.
We can't say it's a totally new phenomenon.
No, right. But it's moving into a new dimension in your view.
It's moving to a new dimension.
When corporations rule the world.
Yeah, that's right now. I mean,
right.
There's no... the title introduces some ambiguity for marketing purposes, but there's no question about the reality. Now, you had the period of enormous corruption during the Civil War and the profiteering, which resulted in a certain amount of concentration of wealth, which then became the foundation. We began to build the large corporations and. As I understand it, very substantial corruption. I mean, very similar to what we have right now in terms of, special favors from Congress and concessions and so forth that allowed the building of these massive corporate fortunes. Then, as you got toward the turn of the century, the thing, enough people, including within the system, became concerned that the thing was becoming unstable with, such levels of inequality and so forth that. You were actually catering to revolutionary forces. So
no, we built into the progressive era. Teddy Roosevelt came along and that sort of thing. And there was some reaction to that. Yeah.
So they started to build in some reforms, and then of course things got sufficiently out of control in the 20s that it triggered the Depression, the financial collapse, the financial speculation, which looks rather much like. What we're replaying right now.
You think so, right? Okay, that's interesting. We can talk about that, later.
But then, with the Depression, allowed Roosevelt to come in, gradually more controls. You move toward a much more pluralistic kind of system with a strong government, strong labor unions, which resulted in actually a massive wealth distribution back in the direction of equality. Greater equality.
Well, away from capital toward labor. Really.
Yeah, so that's when we really began to develop the middle class, that those of us that grew up in the post-war eras just sort of take for granted as, that's what America's about, is the middle class.
Yeah.
But then, then that started eroding again. And
after, particularly about 1973.
Yeah.
Those things didn't track anymore.
Well, there's several things. I mean, our domestic corporate. I mean, there was concern about the, I think about the flower child era and this rejection of consumerism, which was, really a revolutionary attack on the system. But you also had the rise of the East Asian economies and their increasing penetration of our economy. So, many of the leaders in the business community, hey, we're, this thing's getting out of control. It's not working anymore.
Yeah.
Trilateral
Commission founded,
so they started getting much more aggressive in terms of politics and public relations, coming back to the legal system. I mean, you have conservative foundations and conservative funders, specifically funding economics education in law schools. Now, I mean, that's about as transparent as you can get in terms of essentially, recognizing the role of the legal system in protecting this absurdity of corporate rights. So you're introducing this ideological indoctrination into the training of the young lawyers, so that they be sure to have the
again, the lawyers are the you know, the thing they're mostly concerned with, it seems to me. The law and all of it is the economic status of things. I mean, that's what the law in the whole game is about. And we don't well enough understand what exactly that's going on. Because just as you say, in 1973, particularly the transfer of the wealth toward labor and higher wages, and the labor unions were strong, this global pattern was not so well developed. There was the containerization was starting to come. There was the beginning to develop. The Marshall Plan had brought up the Western European countries, the Asian Europe. It was beginning to develop a feisty kind of world situation, which was leading to a global economy. But there was that. But at the same time, there was coming along a technological revolution that was making more and more the technological instruments responsible for actual production vis-a-vis labor.
Yeah.
And so the labor in the mass-produced economy, if Sara Lee now, they produce all kinds of things with not a single person in there doing it. So the claims of labor upon development, upon income, was being based not so much anymore upon their contribution to the actual production in the mass economy, but was being based upon some sort of other principle by which they were going to get income. But it hasn't worked because they're not. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
and the ownership of the capital instruments, so that robots or whatever, is held by a minuscule number of people, and their concentration of the ownership of that wealth in a national and a world scale grows every time we with each passing day.
See, I mean, you want to talk about productivity earlier. Now, you know, that's
well, I actually would like to talk about productivity in one hand, or productiveness in another, which is a new idea that the binary economists are beginning to talk about, that the productivity analysis is not going to work in terms of justice. It's the actual production, but that they want to spread ownership of technological instruments, capital instruments, as a way of distributing income. Rather than only labor. Does that make any sense to you or not?
No, it's absolutely essential.
You do think so?
Yeah. See, I mean, on a number of grounds. One obviously is equity grounds, because, you know, what the system is doing now is using a combination of the more productive technologies, which means you need fewer people to produce the same thing.
Or more. You can produce more.
You can produce more with the same number of people.
The technology is becoming overwhelmingly successful.
But you know, what that means is you're marginalizing more people. Now, if we had a sane society, if a properly organized society, say, you know, increasing productivity is great. You know, it's fabulous if we don't have to work so much to produce the same output or to meet our needs. But of course, that only plays out if, in fact, the benefits of productivity increases are equitably shared.
Yeah, productivity, if I may, I don't mean to make a stickling point, but productivity is usually where you take the whole production of the economy and then divide it by the labor input to it.
Yeah.
And it has a bias toward favoring labor. And those who are concerned with the mass of the people and their good, you know, the fortune of the mass of the people in the society, have tended, the Democrats, the labor unions, the people that were progressives, have tended to emphasize the importance of labor as a value by which they then in return get income because they're contributing to production.
Yeah, but
but now it's the technology that's doing it, and they don't contribute to production. Labor does not contribute to production in the mass economy in the way that they have, and so all of the power of the capital is in the hands of the few people who own that which is producing the wealth, which are these mass-produced systems. It's
not quite the way I'd put it, but it's I wouldn't argue with the analysis. But the larger phenomenon is one of those who control capital shedding the need for labor on the one side,
the technology
because increasing technology, and of course this is combined with the phenomenon of the open economic borders and reduction of tariffs, so that they can also shift what production facilities they do maintain to another country that has very low wages and low environmental standards.
Sure, and they can open up. And they can open up emerging markets if they're undercutting the market potential. Mr. Ruther and Mr. Ford used to have those talks about the workers had to get $5 a day in order to buy the automobiles. You needed to complete supply and demand. It had to create its own supply. I mean, supply had to create its own demand. Say said that, but I mean it hasn't. But they could go to emerging markets over there and try to develop emerging markets and bypass some of the political fallout.
Well, it's not
happen when you start
just developing
the
emerging markets. is producing in the emerging markets
Right.
or contracting out to firms that pay slave wages,
Well, okay,
and then
yeah.
importing the goods back into the United States.
That also, yeah, but it does go, yeah, right.
I mean,
But
that's a very powerful dynamic, of course. I mean, and the combination of the technology and that fear, even if it's not realized,
Absolutely,
of moving the
absolutely.
plant abroad, to be pushing wages down.
Yeah, and just breaking the labor union
Yeah,
movement. Yeah,
and which is all part of a transfer of
Power.
of real wealth, power and wealth, to those who own capital.
yes.
Now, see, the other element of this, in terms of distributed local ownership, is, you know, understanding the real dynamic of this system. Now, yes, as you said earlier, the idea that corporations make a profit is nothing new.
Right.
But part of the question is, what is an adequate profit? What's a fair profit?
Right. Well, if you have competition, they should be able to compete with one another adequately in order to let that be realized.
Well, you know, if you go back to my younger days, you
Yes.
may remember, you know, back in the days when
younger days.
yeah, when AT&T paid a regular 7% dividend,
Yeah.
and you know, we thought that was a pretty good return. It was pretty steady, and
Yeah,
you know,
right.
widows and orphans put their money in that.
Yeah.
You know, now you look at a 7% return, you say, oh, I mean, that's you know, you scoff at that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the average mutual fund in 1995 was returning 25% overall, and over a number of years, the average Standard & Poor's 500 corporation has been increasing profits at a rate of 20% a year.
Mm-hmm. Well, then, do you think this is a solution to the problem? If we could just begin to build ownership into everything through mutual funds and so forth,
Well,
everything's going to be taken care of?
No. See, let me play the argument through in terms of what's happening. I mean, you know, on that level, the issue is that, you know, we've gone way beyond any concept of what is a reasonable profit or a reasonable return on money.
Capital.
Now, well, you call it capital, and that makes it sound like something substantial, but another part of the fallacy here is recognizing that you know, there are capital assets that are real, like buildings and equipment and technology and so forth, but we also tend to use capital to simply refer to money. And you know, that's one of the things I've just been getting more and more into. You know, in a sense, we've almost got two parallel economies. One is the economy by which you make money, quite literally, and the other is the economy that involves real wealth, the creation of real
Capital
wealth.
assets, real assets, right?
Yeah, real
Productive
assets and real
right.
people and real nature and
Right.
you know, productive land and you know, all of that. In fact, understand it. You've actually got to separate these. I mean, remove the money out of the whole system, and just look at how the system operates. You know, the production, the physical production of goods and services, and how that's allocated. And then you realize over here you got this other system for creating and allocating money, which is nothing. I mean, money is nothing but a number. I mean, that's part of breaking out of the illusions and myths and fallacies that befuddle us in understanding economics. That the money system is just purely a system for allocation. It's purely a human artifact. It doesn't exist really except in our minds.
Well, it exists in accounts, numbers, and
It
it's a way of
exists in accounts and
accounting
numbers, but
yeah.
you know, when you talk about capital movements between countries, the capital flows, $1.4 trillion, and most of that's just simply numbers going from one computer.
1.4 trillion. I thought you said 104.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No,
That's you said
1.4 trillion.
104.
Oh, no.
I see.
We're not there yet.
I was going to say, that was a bit of a quantum, you know.
No, we're not there
I
yet.
couldn't fathom it. Yeah. But anyway.
Glad we got that straightened out. But the, you know, most of that has nothing to do with, you know, real capital flowing across borders. It's numbers moving from one computer account to another. It doesn't even necessarily have to go to a different computer. It may.
You don't think this is like getting into virtual economics?
Well, it's very much into virtual reality.
The knowledge industry or something.
And what we've got is a whole class of groups. A lot of them live, you know, work down here in the Wall Street area.
Yeah.
That are terribly good at manipulating the money system. Right. You know, pyramiding values in land and stock markets and so forth, and then, you know, this ends up being the system, which is the only point of accountability of the global corporation.
Okay.
Is to the financial system.
Right.
And you know, if
because the political is being eclipsed.
Yeah.
The political entities on a
The
world scale
politicals-
is being eclipsed as
Exactly.
a
You know,
player.
you don't have any borders as far as the
nation-state doesn't
corporations
make
are
much sense or
concerned.
anything. And these are all just profit centers for
Yeah.
these centrally planned economies that are larger than Castro's Cuba.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now look at some of the rest of the dynamics. Again, we referred back to the share of AT&T, and it
Right.
was very common back in those days, and we didn't have mutual funds. There might be some investment or insurance funds, but normally if you were a participant in the stock market, you owned a real share of stock in a company.
Right.
And most of us, we'd buy a share and we hold it for years.
Right.
Okay. Now it's much more common, if we have an interest in the stock market, which of course only a rather small percentage of the population does, but we're more likely to have it in mutual funds or in some kind of a retirement trust or something of that sort, which is managed by a professional money manager. Okay, so these professional money managers are essentially competing with each other for returns. If you're buying a mutual fund and you look at your fund, you say, gee, my fund only got 5% last year. All these other funds were getting 20, 25, 30.
Sure.
The good ones getting 50%.
Sure, you're going to take notice, of course.
Yeah, say, well, I'm a sucker in here. I'm not going to stay with this. I mean, you have no idea what companies are actually owned here or there, but you just look at the returns. So, that's the pressure the mutual fund managers are on, because their bosses know if their fund is down. I mean, if you're a mutual fund manager and you're not making more or less the average of the mutual funds, your job's on the line. So, okay, they're speculating on short-term price movements.
Right.
And increasingly they get very very aggressive in how they deal with the corporate CEOs. I mean,
like
you
want a better return. Right?
Yeah, like the CEO of Eastman Kodak got fired a couple of years ago because what was it? He'd only laid off something like 5% of his workforce, and they thought he should be laying off 10% to cut those costs.
But if I may, despite the, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. If you made the, is that you want to?
What it is this pressure translates onto the corporate managers to produce very short-term results.
Well, hasn't that always been there? That's always been a lament that they don't look out. We don't have patient capital. We don't have 25, 50-year windows.
It used to be a whole lot more patient than it is now. That's the
Things
point.
are moving too fast now.
Things are moving too fast.
Technology is moving fast. Everything's moving fast. We're moving into a fast lane. Things are going fast. That's part of the reality people.
But also, also more and more of our assets and our markets and our lives are controlled by these very, very large corporate conglomerates.
Oh yeah, there's no question of that, and the financial institutions.
Okay, now look at the difference. If you're, I grew up in a small town, and my background is actually a small business family.
Okay.
We had a retail music and appliance store.
Right.
Okay. Now, whatever you might say about the family and so forth, we were rooted in that community.
Yeah.
We lived in that community.
Right.
My dad belonged to the Kiwanis Club and the
whole thing,
Chamber of Commerce and all that kind of stuff.
Right. It's great. Yeah.
So, I mean, some families have got some advantages and they got a little more power and so forth, but still, you live there. And you're planning to stay there, and his assumption was that he was running that business to turn over to his kids.
Yeah.
So, that's a long-term perspective. And, and he cared about the health of the community. Now you've got a system in which more and more of the wealth and the ownership is not in any way attached to any place or any community. Again, you got money in a mutual fund, you have no idea what companies it's in, you don't know what countries it's invested in, all you know is that rate of return. The manager of that fund, he's out there, now we've got this integrated financial, computerized system.
Yeah.
He's sitting behind a computer terminal. He can buy and sell in virtually any financial market in the world instantaneously. And so, watching the financial services, watching the prices going up, and trading anywhere in the world.
And that seems to be the direction in which things are going.
Yeah, and again, increasingly, he doesn't even care. He doesn't care either what companies he's investing in or what they do.
Because it's a source of income to him.
Yeah, it's purely the estimate of is the price of this corporation likely to go up more in the next few days than the price of this corporation.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, that's like. Trading, yeah. So that the income, the capital has ownership has a distributive capability of income. You can distribute income according to ownership, or you can distribute income according to labor.
That's a very strange concept of ownership, because that fund manager doesn't really own it.
Well, it doesn't. Well, okay.
So the person who's really making the decisions is not the owner. I mean, the real owner, maybe you or me, we're only making the decision of what fund we put it into.
Right. And then that becomes available for capital. I mean, so that what is done with it doesn't matter. It's just a source of income.
Yeah.
And that capital can be a source of income. We sometimes neglect that. We've used the term, in business, they've used the term unearned income, as though the only income that really is earned is that which you have a job and you work and you do something. Labor, we've had this, our Employment Act of 1946 is the basic grounding policy statement for the American institution, and we're committed to the idea that people are going to get income by working at what we call a job.
Well, I think it's not a bad idea.
And we've set it up, and we've rigged, if that's the right term, rigged the system so that despite mutual fund development and that sort of thing, it's pretty well limited to the upper. I mean, some figures see 1% owning 40% of capital assets in our economy.
1% owns 47%.
Well, some figures get high. Well, that's incredible. And it goes into a world pattern that way. So that the ownership of capital...
Yeah, on a world scale, it's worse.
Yeah, right. Okay. There's 285 billionaires in the world or something, and their income is equal to, what, 45% of the population of the world. It's really staggering. But the capital and the ability to own the capital instruments to the degree that that exists in the world is held by so relatively few. It's all financed by self-insurance of putting up collateral capability to make an investment that will pay for itself in 5 to 7 years, the Wall Street standard. It takes for a loan or a business investment to pay for itself. And the capital accumulation keeps going more and more.
Yeah, but see, most of this has nothing to do with real investment.
It doesn't, well, all right, it doesn't have anything to do with real investment, but it has the fact that the vast majority of the population of our nation and the world does not have any means to be able to gain, having no collateral, having no background, having very little to live beyond their immediate needs and so forth, of gaining an ownership of capital instruments that are increasingly responsible in a ratio with labor to production. Yeah. We're becoming capital intensive in the mass-produced economy, and the means of which that capital contributes to production is technical instruments and capital, you know, that kind of thing. Well, so the mass of people cannot get any ownership as a way of getting income, and one wonders whether that should be revisited. That idea they're going to distribute all income according to labor.
You'll sharpen your analysis if you stop talking about capital.
Okay.
And talk about, you know, when you mean money, speak of money.
Okay.
Because so much of what's happening is simply, you know, just because I happen to have a few dollars that I can put in the stock market. I mean, these are, you know, they're nothing but numbers that I happen to have that in, you know, my bank account. I can put it in the market, and I may earn 25, 30, 50% on that.
Over what period? I mean,
a year.
That's incredible earning. I mean, that's a very high.
Well, it is, but if I pick the right mutual fund.
Well, I know, but that's a pretty good track record. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but no, but it's I mean, it's not only astonishing. It's from a social standpoint, it's ridiculous.
Okay.
Because, you know, I haven't put in any entrepreneurial energy. Yeah, but I haven't made any long-term commitments because I can take that money out, you know, any day that I'm concerned that there's a fluctuation in the market. I'm just simply getting a return because I happen to be one of the fortunate people that happens to have a little extra money. Yeah. Some of these numbers that I can put in an account.
Well, that's capital. That's savings. That's capital. That's the thing that is used or has been traditionally.
It's just money.
You think that's all a phantasmagoria or something, or doesn't have any relation to reality?
It is very much a phantasmagoria. See, look in terms of the stock market.
We've only got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Most of the money that goes into the stock market does not go to a corporation. In I mean, this is you know, these are
most of the stock is internally generated. You know, I mean, it's internally,
most of the investment,
new issues.
the real
There's practically no
investment
new
capital is
It's all retained earnings.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that you know, even after I wrote this book, I didn't realize until I read a study from Switzerland that brought this out, that the only money in the stock market that actually goes to a corporation that may in some way be related to real investment, I mean, you know, in plant and equipment, productive capacity or whatever, is the new issues.
And that's minuscule.
Yeah.
In terms of the overall. It's all retained earnings.
It is.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, their estimate, which may actually be high, is that no more than in a mature stock market, no more than 10% of the total capitalization is represented by money that actually went to a corporation in new issues.
In new issues, yeah, right.
So the rest of that
given the situation such as we
the rest of that 90% is just, you know, transfers from one owner to another and involves bidding up the price of the stock.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah, and it goes on.
No,
but
that's money. See, it's not capital in any real sense. It's something that happens within the money system.
I guess. Do you think there's any problem in terms of labor being displaced by technological advance?
Oh, absolutely.
You think that is a reality that is coming?
Absolutely.
And do you think that is
That's
a good
part of
thing?
the real world?
Yeah, Aristotle used to talk about Aristotle used to talk about how the slaves could be able to be freed in the Athenian situation if the loom learned to weave. That we're coming into a situation where technological instruments can become surrogate producers of wealth or of income and wealth, and that that's an advantageous thing that we can see on a world scale. But one wonders, how are we going to do it when all of our criteria for trying to get income to people is their labor, and their labor is becoming less relevant in terms of production, and these robots are becoming more and more productive.
See, that's the key. It is only advantageous if the benefits are equitably distributed.
Yeah, and they're not now.
They're not now.
Well, we do not, as
Most
a national policy, think in terms of expanding ownership. That's the only thing I can think of some sort of representation of the capital side of production. We don't think in terms of distributing that because we're so locked into the idea that we're going to create jobs. We're going to create small jobs for people, or high-wage jobs for people, and we're going to distribute according to the labor. But we're in
and it's mythology.
It is a mythology in your view. Do you think it would be advantageous to try to spread ownership among the mass of the society of the world in order to distribute income according to the way goods are increasingly being produced, in order, if only to vouchsafe your market you're going to need people to be able to buy that which can be produced?
Well, absolutely. You know, and it's both a matter of equity, but it's also a matter of control, and it's a matter of trying to pull our production system back into serving real human needs.
Well, the production system could provide mass-produced goods and services. You know, Sara Lee cookies and whatever you have, or automobiles, television sets, and these kind of things are done with design. Well, but then it could free people to be living lives of real human concern, like we're love and and these kind of real human concerns.
But also, look, you use the example of the automobile.
Yeah.
You know, we've systematically created a society in which, aside from those of us that live in downtown Manhattan, are virtually dependent on an automobile to survive. If you begin to look what happened to our automobile society, more and more of our lives are devoted to earning money to maintain the car. Our landscape is devastated by highways. We become separated from one another. We spend, people that live in the suburbs may spend an hour commuting back and forth. We have literally created unlivable communities and societies mainly to support the automobile.
Yeah, it's something.
So this is another aspect of it in a finite world in which we're pushing up against environmental limits is rethinking the whole way we live.
Right.
I mean, we would be better off if we structured our lives so that we didn't need automobiles.
Well, that might
reduce total production but increase the quality of our lives.
Well, let's get back to Mr. Schumacher. Okay, listen, I'm sorry we could go on talking for hours, but I want to let people know about the book, right?
Yeah.
When Corporations Rule the World, David C. Korten. He's been Dr. David C. Korten. We didn't get a chance. He was at Harvard for years teaching management there, and important must-read, as Mr. Desmond Tutu says. And David, I want to thank you really very much for coming in.
Just quickly,
real quickly,
this is a new organization I'm working with called Positive Futures Network. This is a journal, a journal of positive futures, and what what we're working with here are ways to create societies that really work instead of just saying no to the damage.
And
what are the alternatives? You can
be you're in the book, in the New York City phone book?
No, this is located in Bainbridge Island, Washington.
Okay, they can get in touch with me. We can put them through to you.
Okay, fine.
Again,
very
David,
good.
thank you much. See you next
Thank you.
time, and thank you very much for viewing. Your pleasure.
Okay.
Till next time. Gee, I'm sorry, we're just running right out of time.
Yeah.
That's the trouble, right at the end there. I wish we had known.